Alireza Firouzja has clearly established himself as the second best player in the world, only behind Magnus Carlsen. He has the second highest rating in the world. He has just beaten Ding Liren, the official world champion, and now in our game today, he plays that champion's challenger, Jan Nepomniachtchi. And this game really cinches his status in current chess. Firouzja has white in this game. Nepomniachtchi has black. Firouzja begins with d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, and e3, the Kali system. A very simple opening. And clearly, he's just trying to play a game of chess. He doesn't want a theoretical dispute in the opening. Nepomniachtchi just came off a world championship match. He's got all this theory. Let's just play chess. He says c5, bishop e2, knight c6, castles. And as Firouzja pointed out, this is basically just a queen's gambit declined with reverse colors. Simple as that. Getting the bishop outside of the pawn chain, Nepo plays bishop to g4, h3 kicks the bishop, bishop h5, and now dc5. The idea is that white grabs this pawn on c5. He knows he's not going to keep it, but basically he wants to make black work to capture it and then gain some advantages as black is trying to get that pawn back. e6, obviously opening up the bishop, aiming at this pawn. Now a3. The idea is when the pawn is captured, we'll play b4, then bishop to b2, and get that bishop on that nice long diagonal. Bishop takes c5, b4, bishop d6, first knight b to d2. And the way white attacks this center, black has a little more space in the center, is either e4 or c4. In this case, it's going to be the c pawn. Queen to e7 was played by Nepomniachtchi, and that is a novelty. Before the move a5 had been played. But queen to e7 is played. Bishop to b2, placing that bishop on the long diagonal, a really well-placed piece. Rook to d8, placing the rook opposite the queen so that when the file opens up after the c or e pawn advance, there could be some tactics against that queen. Firouzja plays c4 immediately. Nepo takes it, and we could see that tactic right now. If Firouzja had just grabbed that pawn immediately, then bishop to h2 check unveils the rook against the queen. After king takes bishop, rook takes queen. And white has quite a bit of material for the queen, but black is probably a little bit better already here. So how does Firouzja deal with this pawn? Well, he plays queen to a4, and that controls b5, so he can't defend the pawn, and the pawn it can't be defended. So Nepo just moves it forward to put the bishop on a slightly vulnerable square on c3. The knight at f6 could hit it from d5 or e4. Castles, now knight to c4, aiming at black's dark squared bishop. He'd love to just chop that off. That's a very nice piece for black. Knight to e4, now hitting the bishop, which was moved to c3. The bishop just goes back to b2. I would say this bishop on b2 is probably the real pride and joy of white's position, his most well-placed piece. Now knight to g5. A really interesting idea from Nepo. Basically, he's trying to just wreck Firouzja's kingside pawn structure by taking twice on f3, and it's not that easy to deal with. If knight to g5, then bishop takes e2, hitting the rook and hitting the knight. If knight takes d6, then queen to g5. I mean, if he plays an innocent move like rook f to e1, then boom, bishop to f3, threatening mate, and black already is in complete control of the situation. Instead of that, he'd have to play a move like f4, hitting the queen after queen g3. This is just not a position white wants to be in. So after knight to g5, Firouzja goes ahead and takes the bishop on d6, allowing his kingside structure to be messed up. Bishop takes, now knight to f3, check, and pawn takes. Queen takes d6. So we can look at the basic imbalances as we enter into the main portion of the game. White has a wrecked kingside pawn structure. Black has to take advantage of that. White has a much stronger minor piece. The bishop at b2 is much stronger than the knight on c6, and he's also threatening b5 and picking up the a7 pawn. So white has the better minor piece and queenside pressure. Black's going to have to make something happen on the king side if he wants to fight back. Rook f to d1 hits the queen moves, exchange one pair of rooks. White would love to get those rooks off the board. He wants to make it harder to attack the king, so exchange pieces. But now b5. Kicks the knight away. When the knight moves to e7, queen takes a7. So Firouzja has a little bit of material. He's got one pawn, and he's got this queenside pawn majority that could queen fairly quickly. So black is going to have to find a way to get at white's king very, very fast. Now, he plays the move knight to f5. One of the ideas is the knight can go to h4 and hit this f3 pawn. Computers actually preferred knight to g6, and they were having trouble figuring out why in the postgame, but Firouzja made the point that on g6, the knight could retreat to f8 if there were any back rank issues, and that was why this was supposedly a little bit better move. The knight can get to h4 from either square, but the knight f5 was the move in the game. Rook to c1, hitting the queen, keeping the queen from entering in on c2. Queen to d7, and queen to c5. So what Firouzja plans on doing is just advancing these pawns and trying to queen them. h6 gives a little bit of room for the king to breathe. a4, advancing that very scary pawn majority. And here, Nepo plays a move that ends up being a little too passive. He plays the move rook to a8 to try to slow down that majority. It turns out the best move was actually knight to h4, immediately going after this f3 pawn. And if queen to c4, the idea is after knight f3, king g2, the knight ends up on this awkward d2 square. And black finds himself in a position where you have to save the knight or save the pawn on b7. This is not a good position for black. However, it turns out after queen to c4, Nepo did have the move g5, establishing this knight on the h4 square, and this would have probably equalized for black. But instead he plays the move rook to a8 to slow the majority, queen to b4, defend a4, queen to d3, trying to enter into the kingside position, a5 advance, and now queen to e2. f6 blunting the bishop and controlling this key e5 square was apparently the better way to go. The queen to e2 aiming for f3 apparently now is a little bit too little too late. a6 pushing right ahead. Now queen takes f3 was played. What if he takes the pawn? Well, in that case, you don't retake, but you pass it by with b6. And then if rook to b8, rook to b7, excuse me, after b7, rook to b8, the bishop is threatening to go to e5, hitting that rook. If you stop that with f6 and just rook to c7 check. And it would be all over in that case. So Nepo takes the pawn on f3, and here Firouzja decides to go into an endgame. So I obviously have a big advantage in the endgame. So he plays queen to g4, wanting to trade off queens. But let's see, if queen g4, hg4, hitting the knight, obviously black is in huge trouble if the knight moves. Then bishop to e5, and if the knight takes the pawn, just ab7, and you're controlling the queening square. So Nepo decides to avoid the exchange of queens and plays queen to d5. But notice the construction of the queen and bishop. I talked about how strong this bishop is. They're aiming at the g7 square. So if the knight were to be removed from the position, not like that, were to be removed from the position, it would be mate on g7. So e4 was played by Firouzja, obviously with a fork of the knight and the queen. The queen takes on b5, counterattacking the bishop on b2, and apparently rook to c2 was a powerful idea with the threat of just taking the knight and delivering mate on g7. Firouzja plays bishop to a1 to get out of the threat of the queen. Queen takes a6, pawn takes knight, and Nepo makes a calculation. He says, my best chance is to actually give up the queen for the rook and the bishop, and in this position, try to set up a fortress that Firouzja won't be able to break through. And for a while, observing it, I wasn't sure if he might have been successful. Pawn takes, queen f5, rook to a6, h4, a very important move. Firouzja wants to put this pawn on h5 and fix this g6 square in place so that Nepo cannot play g6. So he goes ahead and plays g6 immediately so that that's not going to happen. Queen to c8, king to g7, now h5. He doesn't mind if the pawn takes, so the fortress would not exist in that case. So instead, Nepo plays g5, queen to c4, making sure the rook can't come to the fourth rank. Rook to e6, queen to c3 check, king to h7, queen to f3, queen takes pawn. So now the question is very simple. Can Firouzja break through on the king side? King g7, king to g3, king g8, queen to d5. So he comes up with a plan. The first plan is to take away the rook's squares on this rank, his sixth rank, Nepo's third rank, and then march his king forward into black's position. That's the basic strategy here. So king to g7, king g4, rook a6, Queen c4 hits the rook to d6, queen c5, rook to e6, queen d4, king g8. Now king to f5. The king is getting closer, and this is essential to robbing this rook of the squares along that rank. Rook to a6, queen to c4 hits it again. Rook to d6, queen to c5, and now the rook has no good place to go. Obviously, if it goes to a6, then just queen would go to c8 and capture it. If it goes to e6, the same idea actually. Queen to c8 check, king moves, and now queen takes rook. Pawn takes, king takes, and this is actually a winning king and pawn endgame, not unlike what happens in the actual game. And here the king dominates, and he just grabs h6 and g5. So after queen to c5, to avoid that, Nepo plays the rook to d3, but now king to f6. Now the king can get through. Rook to f3 check, king to e7, and he cannot check from behind now. That square is controlled by the pawn and the queen. Rook to f4, queen to c8 check, king to g7, queen to f8, king h7, and if we looked at that earlier variation, we know the winning process here. Queen takes f7 check, and now this is a winning king and pawn endgame. And actually, after queen f7 check, Nepo resigned, because in this position, if king to h8, just king to g6 wins the pawns. If he tries to temporize with g4, doesn't matter. Just play king to f6, then the king has to go back. And the pawns are won again. So an amazing achievement from Alireza Firouzja, beating Ding Liren and Nepomniachtchi, now solidly placed number 2 on the live FIDE rating list. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.